In the last decade, China has quietly been monopolising the electric car industry. Not only are Chinese cars infiltrating the UK electric car market, but in 2022, worldwide, China accounted for more than 50% of all electric cars on the world's roads, a total of 13.8 million. And while it's a success story for Chinese car manufacturers, there is a concern that these vehicles will not only dominate UK roads, but also cause a security risk. Dubbed as smartphones on wheels or China's new Trojan Horse, the design of the vehicles have been called into question with concerns over whether China can hack into these cars once they're sold to UK drivers and therefore have access to UK data. Now, if this is content that you enjoy watching, don't forget to like and subscribe to our TalkTV YouTube page. Joining me now to discuss China's electric vehicle dominance is Professor Jim Saker. Thanks so much for your time today, Jim. To kick off, how drastically has the car industry changed with the emergence of Chinese EV cars in the UK?
I think the momentum changed when Boris Johnson announced the 2030 ban on ICE vehicles and in the UK. And that really kind of was 5 years before the EU were due to move in that direction. So therefore, there was a big momentum shift that took place. The car companies were desperate to try and find the alternative powertrains to compete with the Chinese. It's interesting when you look at it. If you go back to Henry Ford, when Henry Ford first launched the Model T, he guaranteed the supply chain. He bought a rubber plantation in Brazil. He bought a steelworks in Pennsylvania, a coal mine in Michigan, and set up the supply lines. So therefore, he guaranteed his supply. When Johnson announced the 2030 embargo on ICE vehicles, there was no looking at the supply chain. And as you said quite rightly, introduction, Maddie, that China dominates the battery market. 95% of that is controlled by China, either including not only the actual batteries themselves, but also the raw materials. And you've got the Belt and Road Initiative that China has taken in Africa. And 80% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so therefore there's a real control that China has over the EV market, and that is worldwide. And that's a real challenge for both the UK and also Europe.
You're absolutely right, Jim, because it does feel like China dominating so many different industries. And you say the Belt and Road Initiative has completely dominated the infrastructure area of Africa, and they're involved in 150 countries worldwide. But in terms of the car industry specifically, how do you think that this will affect the US and European car market?
I think it's forced the legacy manufacturers, the ones that are already really sort of functioning with ICE vehicles, to shift and invest an awful lot of money to move from both diesel, petrol, internal combustion to shift. And that's left them behind the Chinese. The Chinese are dominating the marketplace. And therefore, in the UK, if you're looking at what's going to be happening, is you've got people like MG SEAT and BYD opening up increasing number of dealerships and getting into the UK market. Obviously, in the US, there's a different approach that Joe Biden has put on a subsidy for EV cars, which are actually made by indigenous US manufacturers, that runs to around about $8,000, rising to about $10,000. And that offsets the advantage that the Chinese have in penetrating the US market. But in the UK, there are no barriers and there are no incentives. And so therefore, really, the UK market is being left open to the Chinese coming in.
So is it accurate to say that when the Johnson government announced this initiative to obviously get to net zero, they wanted more electric vehicles on the UK roads? Should the government have put in those proceedings like the Biden administration have done by fixing the supply chain so that it wasn't Chinese vehicles being the more dominant, and they're cheaper as well? So obviously there's more incentive to go buy a cheaper Chinese electric vehicle.
Exactly right. I think that's part of the problem. There wasn't a real kind of strategy in place. There was no industrial strategy. We said, how are we going to get there? And also, looking on the flip side, this year in 2024, every car manufacturer in the UK has to sell 22% of its product range as being EV vehicles. And there's a penalty of £15,000 per unit over that ratio if you get it wrong. £15,000 per unit penalty. Now, that's really interesting when you looked at who were the ones at the bottom who were going to be struggling. The ones that are struggling in the UK would be Toyota, Ford, and Land Rover. Now, those are three companies that have invested heavily in the UK over a number of years with, Toyota plant at Burnaston, and you've got a range of plants, obviously, with Ford and Land Rover. And so therefore, what you've got is, even in this year, the government seems to be penalising the companies that have invested historically in the UK and allowing a free rein for people like Tesla, but also the Chinese EVs coming in.
Do you think it's also accurate to say that China could be using the car industry as a bit of a Trojan horse to sneak into UK data, both on a corporate but also on a personal level for drivers, and therefore could end up destabilising the UK economy?
Well, I think it's interesting when you look at what happened with John Deere in the Ukraine, and when Russia invaded Ukraine, they took over one of the John Deere dealerships in Ukraine and took all the vehicles out of it, the agricultural vehicles. Now, John Deere then stopped them. They remotely demobilized them. They stopped the functioning of the vehicles, and the Russians weren't able to use those particular vehicles. That was a remote interconnection which actually allowed the vehicles to stop and not be started. Now, that's just an example. With Tesla, they had a 2 million car recall in the States, and those vehicles were recalled without going back to the dealership. They were all done remotely. So what you have within the modern connected vehicle is this ability to actually affect the way the car's being driven, but also affect how the individual driver reacts to it. And so therefore that interconnectivity is a big challenge. And it really is fine if you believe that the data and that interconnectivity is being controlled by somebody who you trust. You end up having to trust the manufacturer. So it is undoubtedly possible that China could suck the data from those particular vehicles, and then as a result of that, with the interconnectivity, have an influence on how they're driven. Now, I don't think for 1 minute that BYD would ever, suddenly switch off all their vehicles. That it would be disastrous for their brand. But it is the issue about data in particular, of whether the data is secure when it comes to the actual Chinese vehicles running on the roads, and how personal data can be sort of taken.
Well, on that note, Jim, these electric vehicles, as I said before, have been described as smartphones on wheels, and we know the uproar of China's influence when it came to social media, when it came to TikTok, which is obviously owned by ByteDance. It's a Chinese big company, so much so that, members of the White House have been told that they can't have TikTok on their phone for fear that it will be hacking into government data. There has been this concern for so long, but when you look at someone who understands the intricacies of how cars are made, what tricks and details have these Chinese companies incorporated into these vehicles that could put Londoners at risk, as you said before, basically being able to, turn cars off at the flick of a switch? Is there anything in these cars that could do that?
Oh, yeah, there's no issue that any car could do that. Teslas could be stopped. There's not an issue with that. If there's a will, there's going to be a way in which that can happen. Now, up until now, I'm not calling out China particularly. It's just that the government committee actually said, well, who are the major threats to our security? Well, one was Russia, one was Iran, and one was China. And fundamentally, Russia and Iran are not making cars. The issue with China is that they are. And therefore, this interconnectivity allows someone, if they wish, to actually interfere with how a car is running. And it's nothing clever. Any car, any connected vehicle can do that. It's just who the manufacturer is and the threat that they potentially pose in a particular situation. It's not just China, but it's also potentially that spreading to criminal gangs, the idea of being able to influence how a car is driven. And we've seen with terrorist attacks in both Barcelona and Nice, the way in which vehicles are in fact used in that way.
You're right, Jim, because obviously there's this emergence of electric vehicles that we're not that used to it because it is still fairly new. And when, I haven't even driven an electric car, so I wouldn't even know the intricacies of what is involved and what you're even looking at. But if we get into that kind of nitty and gritty of it, if say in the hypothetical situation that a manufacturing company in China does decide to use these electric vehicles as a weapon, could they do things like quite literally bring London cars to a standstill, or hack into their maps, or eject passengers, or whatever it may be?
Look, in reality, I was speaking in New York about this way before COVID, and saying, look, we can stop cars remotely now. If you had one traveling at 70 mile an hour and just put the automatic braking system on, and everything stopped. And as a result of that, everybody would just pile in the back. And I said, in New York, how many cars would it take to Gridlock New York? And they said, well, possibly 3. One on the Brooklyn Bridge, one coming in from the south, one coming in from the north, because everything would have to be decompacted. You'd have to, take the stuff out from the back. And as a result of that, you would gridlock the New York. Unfortunately, when you mention this in London, there's a slightly different approach. That in reality, because the average miles per hour in London is just under 10, having a car stop just probably means London's a bit more gridlocked than it currently is, but it's just one of those things. But it is a potential threat going forward. It depends whether the manufacturer is actually responsible and going to behave in a particular way. But as you quite rightly say, there is a vulnerability there, which I don't believe the governments are actually confronting. I think the security services are looking at it, but not the governments.
I agree. I mean, we obviously are not trying to scare viewers, but it's more that it's obviously a hypothetical situation, but it's also just like this could happen, because if there were to be a situation where China would want to, use and abuse the fact that they have this data, the fact that they have access to these electric vehicles in a major world city of London, it's just something to, consider. And if on the situation, if this were to ever happen, Jim, is it right to say that we could place this blame on, Boris Johnson's government for not offering alternative companies that weren't Chinese?
I think that there's a lot that Boris Johnson can be blamed for. I don't think we can put down that as being the sole, so him as the solely responsible for it. I think there is an issue, though, that opening up the market so readily is a problem, because the checks and balances have not been put in place. We need to be more convinced that security of vehicles is there, and that people cannot gain access, cannot control, and where the data is actually going. Is the data going straight back to Beijing or Shanghai? Is it something which is actually being controlled in the UK? And that's a big issue for people, because obviously when you plug your Apple iPhone into a car and it's a connected vehicle, you leave a big footprint within that vehicle, that data can be stripped from your iPhone and sent somewhere else. And you've seen it now more recently. People are finding it when you have a hire car, that actually when you jump in the hire car and they haven't defaulted the data on it, you get somebody else's data when you plug in. That if you got their home address, or suddenly comes up on the sat nav, you press that and it's going to where that person lived, because the hire company hasn't actually then defaulted the vehicle to its original settings. So there's stuff like that. There's a legacy and a footprint which occurs within this process, and that could be a major challenge.
Just finally, Jim, from your experience and from what you're saying now, do you see the next decade, especially with a lack of supply, that the UK will completely be dominated by Chinese electric cars, and the threat might be too far out of our control?
There is some research that's been shown that over 50% of car dealers actually believe that the legacy manufacturers will be wiped out when it comes to the EVs because of China's dominance. The other alternative is, and a lot of people are moving in a particular different direction. Zipler, the head of BMW, has said that that hydrogen and fuel cells are the way forward, and they're looking to invest in that. Toyota has been doing that for a long period of time. It really requires the UK government to say, right, what is our industrial strategy going forward as regards cars? Is it going to be purely EV? Is it going to be a mix, with a self-charging hybrid? Or are we going to go to looking for green electricity, which will then allow for green hydrogen, which will then mean that we have a different powertrain completely from what we're currently moving towards. Otherwise, basically, if you're looking at competitive advantage, I totally admire China's strategy as a strategist. You're looking, they've got it sewn up, and it's a real potential for them to dominate this market. It's just whether we want that or not, and whether the UK government and EU are going to push back.
Well, I guess we'll be watching, Jim, because you never know what will happen with an election looming in the UK. We don't know if, either party will kind of make this a promise or they'll, listen to people who are concerned. But thank you so much for your time today, Professor Jim Saker.
Thank you.